Resident Evil 2 is widely regarded as not only one of the best games in the Resident Evil series, but also as a seminal survival horror game and a watershed moment in horror games as a whole. In this video, I will talk about why that is in the most certain terms I possibly can. So let's start simple. The voice acting in Resident Evil 2 is one of the first examples in video games of a skillfully voiced, though not impeccably written story. The first Resident Evil was an absolute shit show as far as voice acting was concerned.
Wow, what a mansion!
And it became rightfully infamous for this.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
This is one of the most obvious and inarguable improvements that Resident Evil 2 boasts over its predecessor.
Jill, here's my radio. You should keep it.
But before I forget, here's a radio. That way we can keep in touch if something comes up.
And the first Resident Evil was created very early on in the PlayStation's life cycle, so it stands to reason that the developers, music composers, and sound engineers at the time would still be getting adjusted to the additional storage space that CDs afforded.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
The second most readily noticeable difference in Resident Evil 2's audio comes from its ambient sounds and music. Nearly every piece of music contained in the game serves to perfectly punctuate and complement the sense of dread, oppression, and mystery that both the graphics and mechanics are meant to convey. The ambient sound effects are also improved, though this is a more subjective sort of argument to make. I know that when I was a kid, the only way I could play this game without being petrified was to mute my TV. It was the only way I could play for any sort of length of time. And I think that says a lot more about this game's audio than anything else I could possibly say. One specific memory I have is of the boarded up hallway after the first Licker encounter. You're so frenzied after seeing this twice-baked zombie beast that you aren't necessarily paying close attention to all the details of this hallway, but you see this story unfolding in the backgrounds of an attempt to fortify this building from the horrors outside, and it stops short, but you have no idea why, because walking through this hallway, it seems calm, it seems quiet, eerie but quiet. So you move through this hallway and you go upstairs, you complete a few tasks up there, and then head back down, and you're walking through this hallway completely at ease, only to have zombie arms shoot through the boarded up windows and grab at you, instantly filling in the blanks of why this little construction project had to stop short of completion. This is one of the most vivid memories I have of video games throughout my entire life, and without the audio in this game, it just could not and would not have landed the way it did. Now, the Resident Evil series certainly boasts its share of impressive visuals and art design. Resident Evil 2, however, is where the series truly hit its stride. For anyone who does not look into these things usually, the first Resident Evil games, as well as Resident Evil 0 and the GameCube remake, use a graphical technique called pre-rendered backgrounds. This is the trick that grants the Resident Evil games their sharp, defined, and moody visuals, even on dated and underpowered hardware. The way this is done is by having a more powerful computer render the game's visuals, then converting those visuals into either a flat texture, like flooring or wall, or into an animated texture, such as backgrounds with moving elements. This means that the device running the game only has to place those pre-baked elements onto the area geometry, rather than having to generate or render those pieces individually and wasting valuable system resources. So now that we got that out of the way, the backgrounds of Resident Evil 2 are masterfully crafted. They perfectly convey the mood and atmosphere that each area requires in order to put the player into the desired mindset. The pre-baked lighting and shading granted what was at the time a near unprecedented level of fidelity and put these games nearly a generation ahead of anything else at the time. So the game moves deftly from outdoors through back alleys and side streets of the now dead Raccoon City into the cavernous interiors of the police station, to the industrial sections of the basement, to the sewers of the city, and finally the hidden Umbrella Lab. Every area of the game has a level of consistency that you would not expect considering the variety of locations. The city, parking garage, and sewers serve as a sort of buffer area to ease the transition between the different environments. This really helps the visuals flow when you're moving from area to area, and it's a really great example of this when you first enter the garage or basement portion of the police station. This area is a serious shift from the decadence of the police station proper and gives you a taste of the more industrial flavor that you're going to get in the sewers and finally the lab in the game's final chapters. This is my absolute favorite thing to talk about when discussing games. One of the best things about good level design is that it transcends hardware generations. It's a feature unique to games and is one of the defining reasons, or indeed the primary reason outside of outright nostalgia, that retro games are still part of modern discussion. Resident Evil 2 has what is, in my opinion, some of the best level design in any game. The police station is an especially great example of this. The police station loops in on itself, naturally easing the pain of backtracking to earlier areas and save points. The best example of this is the ladder that descends from the second floor balcony of the police station lobby down to the first floor. This grants the player easier access to the police station's first typewriter and entire first floor. It also allows a subversion of players' expectations, an exceptionally useful tool in a horror game. A perfect example of this is the very same liquor hallway visited earlier in the game can become treacherous later on if the player does not think to bring an acquired item back to lock down the shutters in this hallway. This same looping trick has been used in many games since, and probably some before that I'm not realizing. One of the most frequently cited examples of this being from Software's Souls games, Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and so on. The biggest obstacle in having this sort of level design in a game like Resident Evil 2 is that it is meant to take place in what is more or less supposed to be the real world. And considering that, the story's explanation for this complex and ridiculously impractical means of laying out a building is relatively sound considering. At least when compared to the increasingly crazy reasons thought out by future installments in the series. Text documents littered throughout the game inform the player that this police station used to be a museum, explaining the labyrinthine layout and lavish decor. And this segues to my next talking point. While an absolute mess has been made with the Resident Evil canon in the many years since Resident Evil 2, the story of Resident Evil 2 is simple enough and offers a relatively satisfying tale. Both of the game's protagonists have supporting characters that come into play fairly early on, and this serves to give them some motivation in pressing through the events of the story. Claire is given Sherry, a little girl hiding in the police station, waiting for her parents. She's given a central role in the story later on, and it is for this reason that I would consider Claire's story to be the much stronger of the two on offer. Leon is given Ada, a spy who uses Leon to further her own goals. This is a problematic relationship, to say the least, as in the story, Leon doesn't seem to really have any motivation to protect Ada. Beyond that, he's just a good dude. And don't get me wrong, Leon, that's rad and all, but it would take some pretty serious motivation for me to take a bullet and then trudge neck deep through turd-filled water with a sucking, bleeding, giant chest wound. But I digress. These misgivings aside, the game has a serviceable and mostly satisfying story. While it was pretty groundbreaking at the time, it can certainly come off as cheesy when considered in a modern context, and it's for that reason that, to my mind, story is one of the game's weakest points insofar as considering it a timeless work goes. Resident Evil is infamous for its convoluted puzzles and means of progression. In my experience, however, Resident Evil 2 improved this drastically over its predecessor. One good example is that in the garage area, the crowbar has had its name changed to the manhole opener. While this has been criticized regularly for the perceived insult to the player's intelligence, the momentum that things like this help the player maintain is more than worth the trade as far as play experience goes. Tiny changes like this are placed throughout the game's entirety in order to help keep things moving along naturally. This is described as dumbed down in some circles, and while that is a valid criticism, I think streamlined is probably a more fair description in this case. This becomes less important when considering the game in a modern context, as internet guides, walkthroughs, and let's plays can quickly resolve any real barriers to progress that are in the player's way. Pros and cons weighed, however, I still consider this to be a net gain over the game's predecessor and a valuable modification that some subsequent games took way too far. Alright, so let's wrap this shit up. I've probably replayed this game more than any other individual game in my relatively long and storied transition from fetus to child to man-child. I'm sure this does not hold true for everyone, and as with everything in life, your mileage may vary, but for this particular man-child, Resident Evil 2 is a near masterpiece and a good entry point into horror games for anyone that can overlook the game's now dated presentation. So, in summation, Resident Evil 2 is pretty rad. So, thanks everybody for watching. Hope it didn't suck too bad. Hit like and subscribe if you'd like me to make more content. As long as I get a couple, I'll probably do it. And thanks to Mike Bettencourt for providing most of the footage.
Ouch!